Hey, welcome back to Anti-Social Studies and part 3 in my few episodes on a brief history of race and racism. Today we're going to sort of wrap everything up. So in part 1, I talked about the slave trade and the type of slavery that was instituted in the early American colonies in the United States, chattel slavery. And then last episode in part 2, we talked about how Europeans just sort of invented this label of whiteness. And now it's all going to come together as we talk about which came first, slavery or racism. Let's just get right to it. The definitive answer is slavery came first. Right, I've already mentioned how slaves had come from all over the world before the 1600s. Basically, institutionalized racism. And again, I can't give the history of every individual person's feelings about another person's skin color, but racism on a systemic scale rose up after slavery had existed as a way to justify and preserve the specific type of slavery that the Americas created. So again, why were Black Africans the ones who were enslaved? And we, and by we I mean white civilization, have come up with so many other answers to this question over the years. They had different cultures that we saw as uncivilized. They weren't Christian. They didn't have united governments to resist. They weren't intelligent enough for any other line of work. They were physically stronger and could work more than white people. And all of these explanations are wrong. They all fall apart under any sort of scrutiny. Africans became Christian. They had massive, well-organized empires. There's no genetic difference between white and Black people that makes one smarter or stronger than the other. So why Africa? It's geography. Again, the continent of Africa had a thriving slave trade for centuries, with states selling their prisoners to Arab slave traders around the Indian Ocean. And now, again, this type of slavery was very different from chattel slavery, which I hope I've shown you in part 1, but in reality, slaves could have come from anywhere in the world. Or nowhere, right? We could have just not have slavery, if you think about it. But with the Portuguese and the Spanish starting off the conquest and the settlement of the New World, the easiest place to stop off and steal some people was West Africa. And everything that came afterwards, the idea that Black people were inferior to white people, the idea that white people was even a real category, racism, etc., all of that came later to justify the simple fact of geography and some pretty horrifying heartlessness in the name of economic gain. So I could go on, but the answer is racism. Plain and simple, because racism was manufactured for the express purpose of continuing the practice of slavery long after Europeans had become enlightened on so many other truths about the nature of humanity. And so you might be thinking to yourself at this point, or I hope you're thinking this, why? Why was it so important for Europeans to build a system that kidnapped and abused millions of Africans and then enslaved every child born to those Africans for almost 300 years? There is no good answer to this question, but when in doubt, whenever you're looking at the world and wondering, why are they doing this? The answer is almost always wealth. Just think of Woodward and Bernstein and follow the money, right? Now, I'm not going to get into a whole lecture about European competition for colonies and mercantilism because that's world history that I've already covered in season 1 of my podcast, Anti-Social Studies. But basically, the Europeans stumbled upon 2 entire continents that in their eyes were completely unsettled and open for business. And so think about this in context. The Europeans had just come out of their Middle Ages looking for a way to create more wealth, but they were hemmed in on all sides. I mean, Britain was a freaking island, right? Where are they going to go? From their perspective, all the good land had already been conquered by the Muslims, the Indians, the Chinese. They'd all called dibs and there wasn't anything left for the Europeans. They'd missed the boat, literally, after they fell apart and started torturing each other when Rome fell. Okay, they were desperate to get in on the trading action, which meant getting to China and India, but they were blocked by powerful Italian city-states and Islamic empires that were still a little salty about the Crusades. So they were so desperate that they were literally just sending off ships into the abyss and keeping their fingers crossed that someone would come back with something. And oh my God, it worked. When the New World was discovered, it was like a lifeline for powerful European monarchs who were looking for some way to distinguish themselves against the competition. They had to claim the land, settle the land, and start working the land fast before another king could get there first. And so all of the options that I listed in part 1, right? Keeping your business model proportionate to the labor you have available. Boring and slow. Finding workers to travel across the world and pick cotton for money. It sounds hard to convince people to do that. No, thank you. Indentured servitude. So I'm gonna pay them to come over and then they leave after 5 years and I have to start all over. That's exhausting. Serfdom, tempting, but still slow. Enslaving millions of Africans and forcing them to come work on your plantation, and then bonus, having a continuous supply of slaves as they have children? That's more like it, said the Europeans. Chattel slavery was fast. It was effective. The only problem was that it was astonishingly inhumane. But as we've seen, they took care of that hiccup with racism, and the rest was history. They made millions or billions off of the new triangular trade from the colonies. Racism became entrenched and mostly unquestioned, and the system worked entirely too well for the Europeans for the next few centuries. And I say that this went mostly unquestioned because it's important to point out that not every white European was on board with slavery. See, like I did a whole thing about Roger Williams in episode 1 of my 3rd season of my podcast. There were groups like the Quakers that understood from the very beginning that this was a terrible thing and they fought against it. And there were other truly enlightened thinkers who saw that the development of ideas like rights and liberty and a voice for the people was just incompatible with enslaving others. Ooh, just go listen to my episode all about Lafayette, the love of my life. But overwhelmingly, the system of slavery and the racism that came along with it was generally accepted in the Americas. And we really can't understand US history without understanding this truth. So here's the point. And again, I really just hope you'll go check out my full episode on slavery in American history. It's in season 3 of Antisocial Studies to get the details on this. But slavery was not inevitable. It was not the obvious choice. It was not just the way things were back then. From the beginning, there were many voices pointing out the wrongness of slavery, and enslaved Africans were pushing against the societal structures that kept them enslaved. By 1865, it had been 246 years since the first slaves arrived in the United States. So that means it's only been 155 years since slavery was abolished, meaning it will be almost another 100 years before America's history will be longer without slavery than with it. Also, slavery and racism were man-made. It's terrible. Human beings manufacture differences between each other and then hatred for those differences to serve their own desires for wealth and power. But there's also a part of it that makes me weirdly hopeful, because if we created it, then we can also deconstruct it. But it takes acknowledgement, especially on the part of white Americans, to understand that slavery didn't just happen, which means that it also can't just end with a proclamation or a constitutional amendment. Slavery was an elaborate and complex structure that was built over hundreds of years. It was like this prison that enslaved Africans were forced into. They were shackled to the walls. This massive complex included a legal system, the government at all levels, economics, cultural discrimination, and societal exclusion, all to back up this system. And just because African Americans were eventually unshackled from the walls of that prison doesn't mean it's over. Even after slavery ended in the 1860s, they will still live inside this complex structure that we built. And over the late 19th and the 20th century, we're going to slowly work to take apart that building, but to think that it's completely gone is to ignore history and means you can't at all understand the Black Lives Matter movement or what's going on in our country today. So let's just keep working.